The old sewing machine sat quietly in the corner of my living room, just as it had for nearly 40 years. Its black metal body had faded slightly with time, but the golden floral pattern still shimmered under the afternoon sunlight. The wooden cabinet beneath it had scratches and dents, each mark telling a story from decades of use. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than an outdated piece of furniture. But to me, it was everything. I ran my fingers across the smooth wheel, remembering the countless nights I had spent sitting there, sewing clothes for my family. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old, a widow, and a mother of one daughter, Emily. That sewing machine had been with me longer than almost anyone else in my life. My husband, Robert, gave it to me shortly after we got married in 1979. Back then, we had almost nothing. Robert worked long hours at a small auto repair shop, and I stayed home with our newborn daughter. Money was always tight, and sometimes we had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. One evening, Robert came home carrying a heavy wooden crate. He said, "I found something for you," with a proud smile. When he opened the box, I saw the most beautiful machine I had ever laid eyes on, a Singer sewing machine. Even back then, it wasn't new. Robert told me he had bought it from an old tailor who was closing his shop. "It's old," he said nervously, but he swore it still works perfectly. I remember laughing as I hugged him. Old or not, that machine changed our lives. I started sewing clothes for neighbors. At first, it was simple things, hemming pants, fixing torn jackets, stitching school uniforms. But soon, word spread quickly. Soon, people from across town were bringing me their clothes to repair. Within a year, the money I earned from that sewing machine helped us pay our rent. By the time Emily started school, I was sewing wedding dresses. I still remember the soft hum of the machine late at night while the rest of the house slept. That steady rhythm became the soundtrack of my life. It paid for Emily's school supplies. It paid for her birthday presents. It even helped Robert and me save enough money to buy this house. After Robert passed away 10 years ago, the machine became even more precious to me. It was the last thing in the house that still carried his touch. But Emily never saw it that way. To her, it was just junk. I stared at the man on my porch, trying to process what he had just said. $80,000. The number sounded unreal, like something from a television show rather than real life. "My daughter threw it out this afternoon," I said slowly. "It should still be near the trash bins outside." The man looked concerned. "That's the problem," he replied. "I drove by earlier and saw it sitting there. I recognized it immediately because I collect antique sewing machines." My heart began to race. "So you took it?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. I stopped my car to examine it, but before I could move it, another truck pulled up." "What kind of truck?" "A small moving truck. 2 young men jumped out and loaded the machine into the back." My stomach dropped. "They didn't live around here?" "No, I've never seen them before." I leaned against the door frame, suddenly feeling weak. "So it's gone." The man hesitated. "Possibly, but there's still a chance we could track it down." I looked up at him with a spark of hope. "How?" He smiled slightly and pulled out a business card. "My name is Daniel Harris," he said. "I deal in antique collectibles." I took the card and read it carefully. Antique restoration and collectibles. "You really think it was worth that much?" I asked. He nodded confidently. "If it's the model I believe it is, absolutely." I felt my chest tighten. "That machine belonged to my husband," I whispered. Daniel's expression softened. "May I ask where he got it?" "He bought it from a tailor almost 50 years ago." Daniel's eyes widened. "That actually makes sense." "How?" "Because the Singer Model 66 was extremely popular among professional tailors in the early 20th century. He continued speaking with the excitement of someone who loved history. But some of the early versions were produced in very limited numbers. And those are the ones collectors fight over. I shook my head in disbelief. For 40 years, I thought it was just an old sewing machine. Daniel chuckled. That's the funny thing about antiques. Sometimes people live with treasures without realizing it. A bitter thought crossed my mind. My daughter thought it was trash. Daniel sighed. That happens more often than you'd think. We walked outside together toward the curb where the garbage bins stood. The street was quiet under the dim glow of the streetlights, but the spot beside the garbage bins was empty. The sewing machine was gone. I stared at the empty space as if it might magically reappear. "This is where it was," I said. Daniel crouched down and examined the pavement. After a moment, he pointed to faint scratches on the asphalt. "See these marks?" I nodded. "That's from something heavy being dragged." My heart sank even further. So those men really took it? Yes, but that might not be entirely bad. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If they knew what it was worth, they wouldn't have grabbed it so casually." "Meaning?" "They probably thought it was just an old machine they could resell for a few $100s. Daniel stood up and brushed the dust from his hands, which means they might try to sell it quickly. And that's where we might get lucky. How? Antique dealers talk to each other. If someone suddenly shows up with a rare Singer Model 66, word spreads fast. For the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of hope. "You really think we could find it?" Daniel nodded. "It's possible, but we'll have to move quickly." Just then, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A white SUV slowly turned the corner and parked in front of my house. Emily stepped out of the car. She looked surprised when she saw me standing outside with a stranger. "Mom, what's going on?" Her eyes moved to Daniel suspiciously. "Who's this?" Before I could answer, Daniel spoke. "Good evening. My name is Daniel Harris." Emily crossed her arms. "And why are you at my mother's house?" Daniel pointed toward the empty space near the garbage bins. "I was asking your mother about the sewing machine that was thrown away earlier today." Emily shrugged. "Oh, that old thing?" "Yes," Daniel said calmly. "Do you realize what you threw away?" Emily laughed. "A broken antique?" Daniel looked directly at her. "A rare 1920 Singer sewing machine worth approximately $80,000. Emily's smile vanished instantly. "What?" "You heard me." She stared at him as if he had just spoken another language. That's impossible." Daniel pulled out his phone and showed her a picture. "This is the exact model." The image looked identical to the machine that had sat in my living room for decades. Emily's face slowly turned pale. "You're saying that thing was worth more than my car?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Silence filled the street. Emily suddenly looked at me. "Mom, please tell me he's joking." I shook my head quietly. "He's not." Her eyes widened in horror. But I threw it away." Daniel spoke again. "Actually, 2 men picked it up before the garbage truck arrived." Emily grabbed her head in panic. Wait, so someone just took $80,000 from our trash?" Daniel nodded again. "That's one way to put it." Emily's voice trembled. "We have to get it back." For the first time that night, I looked at my daughter and saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not sadness, not regret, fear, because she finally realized the truth. Her attempt to make the house look modern had just cost her a fortune, and now someone else might be driving away with it. The hidden history. Emily stood frozen beside her car, staring at Daniel as if he would hope he would suddenly say it was all a misunderstanding. But Daniel's calm expression never changed. "You're serious?" she asked again. "Yes, very serious." Emily slowly turned to me. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me that machine was worth money?" I let out a soft sigh. "Because I didn't know." And it was the truth. For all the years that machine had been part of my life, I had never once thought of it as something valuable. To me, it wasn't money. It was memories. It was the sound of the needle stitching late at night while Emily slept in the next room. It was the reason we always had food on the table when times were hard. But Emily saw things differently. Her voice became sharper. Well, we need to find it now. Daniel nodded. I agree. He turned toward me again. May I ask you a few questions about the machine? Of course. Did it have any markings or numbers on it? I thought for a moment. There was a small metal plate near the base with numbers engraved on it. Daniel's eyes lit up. That's the serial number. He quickly opened a small notebook from his pocket. Do you happen to remember it? I shook my head. I'm afraid not. That's all right, he said. Even without the number, the design you described strongly suggests it's an early Singer Model 66. Emily looked confused. What makes that model so special? Daniel leaned against the fence as he began explaining. In the early 1900s, Singer produced thousands of sewing machines every year. Most were very common, but a few special production runs were made with unique mechanical parts and decorative patterns. He paused for emphasis. Some of the early versions were exported overseas. Others were given to professional tailors. Emily crossed her arms impatiently. And only a small number of those early machines survived in working condition. He looked directly at me. If yours still worked after all these years, collectors would consider it extremely valuable. Emily groaned. I can't believe this. Then she suddenly looked at me again. Mom, why didn't you stop me from throwing it away? Her words made my chest tighten. I wasn't home, Emily. She opened her mouth to argue, but quickly stopped. Deep down, she knew the truth. Daniel checked his watch. If those men took the machine intending to sell it, they might try one of the local antique markets or pawn shops. Emily immediately grabbed her cheese. Then let's go. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Right now? Yes, she said urgently. We're not losing $80,000. I noticed something in her voice. Not concern for the memories, not regret for throwing away something precious to me. Only money. But I said nothing. Daniel thought for a moment before nodding. All right, I know a few places that deal in antiques even at night. We drove through the city for nearly an hour. Daniel led the way in his car, while Emily and I followed behind in her SUV. The streets were mostly quiet by then, with only a few shops still open. Our first stop was a pawn shop near the old train station. The neon sign outside flickered as we walked inside. The shop smelled of dust and old metal. A heavyset man stayed behind the counter. Daniel approached him first. Good evening, Frank. The man squinted at him. Well, if it isn't Danny the collector. Daniel smiled politely. Have you seen anyone trying to sell an antique Singer sewing machine tonight? Frank scratched his beard. What kind? Model 66, early 1920s. Frank thought for a moment before shaking his head. Nope, haven't seen anything like that. Emily's shoulders dropped in disappointment. Daniel thanked the man and we left. We visited 2 more antique dealers that night. Both gave us the same answer. No sewing machine. By the time we returned to Emily's car, she was pacing angrily in the parking lot. This is impossible, she muttered. Someone must have taken it. Daniel remained calm. They did, but they might not. The flea market. Emily drove faster than I had ever seen her drive before. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she followed Daniel's car through the quiet streets. The clock on the dashboard showed 10:47 p.m. Please still be there, Emily kept whispering. I sat quietly beside her, watching the city lights pass by. For me, it wasn't about the money. I simply wanted that sewing machine back. After nearly 20 minutes, Daniel turned into a large parking lot filled with small stalls and tents. Even late at night, the flea market was still open. Lights hung from wires above the vendors, casting a warm yellow glow across tables filled with antiques, tools, and secondhand items. Daniel parked and quickly stepped out of his car. They're probably near the back, he said. Emily didn't wait. She hurried ahead of us, scanning every table desperately. Then Daniel suddenly stopped. There, he said quietly. At the far end of the market stood a folding table. And sitting proudly on top of it was my sewing machine. Even from a distance, I recognized the black metal body and the golden floral designs. My heart filled with relief. "It's still here," I whispered. Two young men stood behind the table, talking to another man who appeared to be a buyer. The buyer was examining the machine closely. Daniel quickly walked toward them. "Excuse me," he said calmly. The two sellers looked up. "Yeah?" Daniel pointed to the machine. "Where did you get that?" One of the young men shrugged. "Found it near some trash bins." Emily stepped forward angrily. "That was my mother's." The men exchanged looks. "Well, it's ours now," one replied. Emily pointed at the price tag hanging from the machine. It read $300. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. "You're selling it for $300? "Yeah," the seller said. "It's old, but it still works." The buyer beside them spoke up. "I was just about to pay for it." Emily turned to him quickly. "Wait, please don't." The buyer frowned. "Why not?" Daniel stepped forward. "Because that machine is worth far more than $300. The two young men suddenly looked interested. "How much?" Daniel answered calmly, "Approximately 80,000. The two young men nearly dropped their coffee cups. "What?" The buyer stared at the machine again with completely new interest. Emily quickly reached into her purse. "We'll buy it right now." The sellers crossed their arms. "Oh no," one said. "The price just changed." Emily clenched her jaw. "How much?" The man thought for a moment. 10,000. Emily's face turned red. "That's ridiculous." Daniel leaned toward her and whispered quietly, "Compared to 80,000, it's actually cheap." Emily hesitated. She clearly hated the idea of paying for something she had thrown away, but she also knew the machine was worth much more. Finally, she pulled out her phone. Fine. She transferred the money. The sellers grinned as they received the payment. Pleasure doing business. They lifted the machine carefully and handed it to us. After everything that had happened, the sewing machine was finally back in my hands. The final lesson. When we returned home later that night, Emily carried the sewing machine inside carefully. She placed it back in its original corner of the living room. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then she turned to me. "Mom, I'm sorry." It was the first time she had said those words all night. I shouldn't have thrown it away. I nodded gently. "That machine isn't valuable because of money." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" I placed my hand softly on the old wooden cabinet. "That machine fed our family when we had nothing. It helped pay for your school clothes. It even helped us buy this house." Emily looked down at the floor quietly. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," I said kindly. "You only saw something old." I looked at her with a small smile. "But sometimes the oldest things carry the greatest value." Emily nodded slowly. "I understand now." Then she glanced at the sewing machine again. "What are you going to do with it?" I thought for a moment. Then I said something that surprised both of us. "I'm not selling it." Emily blinked. "Not even for $80,000? I shook my head. "No, because this machine is worth far more than money." I turned the wheel gently, listening to the familiar hum of the needle moving again. For the first time in years, I decided to sew something. And this time, Emily sat beside me and watched quietly.